"Give me 20 minutes, the woman mechanic said. The millionaire laughed, but then stopped. The late afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the cracked pavement of Highway 70 outside Nashville, creating heat mirages that made the asphalt shimmer like water. Margaret Whitmore gripped the leather steering wheel of her 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud with arthritic fingers, her rings catching the light as her hands trembled with fury. The temperature gauge climbed into the red zone, steam hissing from beneath the gleaming hood like a dying dragon's final breath. First, it had been the temperature warning light, then the knocking sound, then the smoke, thick white plumes billowing from under the hood that she had stubbornly ignored for the last 20 miles, convinced that Margaret Whitmore's cars didn't dare inconvenience her schedule. Her meeting with the development consortium began in exactly 90 minutes at Pinnacle Tower in downtown Nashville. It was the crowning achievement of her career, a $600 million mixed-use development that would cement her legacy as the Iron Lady of Southern real estate. 60 years of ruthless deal-making, all culminating in this single moment. And here she sat, stranded on a rural highway, surrounded by endless soybean fields, cows watching with infuriating indifference. In the suffocating silence of rural Tennessee, she'd spent her entire life escaping. Margaret Whitmore wasn't accustomed to things going wrong. At 87, born in a sharecropper's shack, her life had been a meticulously orchestrated ascent from poverty to power. First property at 24, first million at 32, building an empire through sheer will that had never once accepted defeat. When she spotted the faded sign reading, Thaxton Auto Repair and Restoration since 1965, a bitter laugh escaped her lips. The letters were sun-bleached and peeling. What miracle could a backwoods mechanic perform on a vehicle worth more than they'd earn in a decade? The Rolls-Royce shuddered one final time before dying completely in front of a workshop frozen in time. An era Margaret thought she'd left permanently behind. Margaret Whitmore's world had always operated on two fundamental principles: precision and control. At 87, she had outlived two husbands, built a $3 billion real estate empire from a single rundown property in East Nashville, and earned the nickname Iron Lady through 5 decades of deal-making so ruthless that grown men had wept in her conference room. She collected fears like other women collected pearls, knew exactly which pressure point would make a rival crumble, which threat would make a banker cave, which cold silence would break even the most stubborn negotiator. Today's meeting represented her crowning achievement, the capstone of a lifetime spent clawing her way up from nothing. The Pinnacle project would reshape downtown Nashville's skyline, transforming 6 city blocks into a mixed-use development that would generate billions and etch her name permanently into the city's history. At 87, with mortality finally beginning to whisper in her ear, this deal mattered more than all the others combined. But 40 miles outside the city, her beloved Silver Cloud, purchased in 1965 with her first million, maintained obsessively ever since, had betrayed her. The engine's death rattle still echoed in her ears as steam continued rising from under the hood in accusatory plumes. Her phone was dead. No signal anyway. Panic clawed at her chest, a sensation Margaret Whitmore never permitted herself. Through the heat shimmer, she spotted the weathered sign, Thaxton Auto Repair and Restoration. The name meant nothing to her, just another forgettable small business in forgettable small-town America. She approached on unsteady legs, leaning heavily on her mahogany cane, a gift from the mayor after she'd donated a wing to Vanderbilt Medical, already marshaling the imperious tone that had moved mountains and crushed opponents for 6 decades. What she found stopped her cold. A young woman, late 20s, slid out from beneath a vintage Mustang on a creeper, grease-stained coveralls, blonde hair escaping a messy bun, wiping her hands on a rag that looked older than she was. Joyce Thaxton wiped her hands on a rag already black with accumulated grease, her blonde hair falling loose from its messy bun, a smudge of oil across her cheekbone like war paint. She wore faded denim coveralls, steel-toed work boots with the leather cracking at the seams, and an expression of calm competence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she could do. Margaret's first words dripped with condescension honed over decades. "I need a real mechanic. Is there a man who works here?" Joyce didn't flinch. She'd heard it all before. Every variation of the same tired doubt. I'm the mechanic. I'm also the owner. What seems to be the problem? Margaret's lip curled. The irony wasn't lost on her. At 87, having fought through the boys' clubs of 1960s real estate, having endured countless men who'd assumed she was a secretary or mistress rather than the woman signing their paychecks, she thought she'd transcended such petty prejudices. But apparently her feminism had limits. Boardrooms, yes. Grease pits, no. Joyce approached the Rolls-Royce with the focused intensity of a cardiac surgeon, running her oil-stained fingers along hoses and belts, listening to the engine's silence with her ear pressed against still-hot metal. She popped the hood without asking permission, leaning into the engine bay with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to read mechanical failures like other people read books. Vapor lock in the fuel system, overheated fuel pump, she diagnosed after 2 minutes of silent examination. Classic issue with 65 silver clouds in this heat. The fuel line runs too close to the exhaust manifold on these models. Give me 20 minutes. The laughter that erupted from Margaret was sharp, cruel, dismissive. Decades of accumulated power concentrated into pure mockery. It echoed across the empty lot like a whip crack. You expect me to trust a girl playing mechanic to fix a vehicle worth more than this entire property? Than everything you'll ever own? Joyce's jaw tightened, muscle flexing beneath sun-browned skin, but she didn't rise to the bait. She'd heard it all before, from customers who demanded to speak to her father or brother, both long dead, from men who assumed she was the secretary or the girlfriend of the real mechanic, from women who believed getting your hands dirty was somehow beneath feminine dignity. She developed a thick skin over the years, learned to let the condescension slide off like water off chrome. But there was something about this particular elderly woman's cruelty that felt different. Personal. Targeted. Like a blade that had been searching for years and finally found its mark in an old wound. Thaxton, Joyce repeated slowly, deliberately, watching the old woman's face with new intensity. Joyce Thaxton. My grandfather opened the shop in 1965. Same year your car was made, actually. Bought the land with his savings, built it with his own hands. Something flickered across Margaret's weathered face. A brief shadow, a ghost of recognition, quickly suppressed like a flame being snuffed. Thaxton, she repeated, and the word turned strange in her mouth, foreign, dangerous. That's a common enough name, nothing unusual about it. But her voice had lost its certainty. The imperious edge wavered like heat shimmer on asphalt. Joyce studied the old woman with new attention, seeing past the initial impression of generic wealth and arrogance. She saw the expensive cream linen suit, now wrinkled and dark with sweat stains under the arms, the Hermes scarf in shades of gold and burgundy, probably worth more than Joyce's monthly mortgage. The rings on arthritic fingers, diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, each one likely representing a deal closed, a building purchased, a competitor crushed. The imperious bearing that age's ravages couldn't quite diminish, the way she held her mahogany cane like a scepter rather than a mobility aid. And something else, something in those sharp blue eyes, ice-cold and calculating, even now. The particular set of that jaw, square and stubborn. The way she stood despite obvious pain, refusing to show weakness. The specific quality of her cruelty, not casual or thoughtless, but owned, weaponized, deliberate. Joyce had seen exactly one photograph of this woman. Yellowed, creased, kept in her grandfather's journal. A newspaper clipping from 1983. Mrs. Whitmore, Joyce said suddenly, the name coming to her lips with a taste like rust and old blood. Margaret Whitmore, the Iron Lady of Southern real estate. The color drained from Margaret's face beneath layers of carefully applied makeup, leaving her skin the gray-white of old paper. Her grip on the cane tightened until her knuckles went bone-white, and for a moment Joyce thought the old woman might actually fall. How do you? Margaret began, but her voice died in her throat. How do you know who I am? Margaret demanded, but her voice trembled slightly, the first crack in armor that had never shown weakness in 6 decades. Joyce set down her tools with deliberate, careful movements, the way someone might set down something fragile or dangerous. Because your name has been spoken in my family for 40 years. Never fondly, never with anything but pain. She straightened, wiping her hands one final time, and despite the grease stains and youth, despite the oil smudged across her cheek and the coveralls 2 sizes too large, there was a dignity in her bearing that made Margaret take an involuntary step backward. Thomas Thaxton was my grandfather. Your chauffeur from 1975 to 1983. 8 years of perfect, loyal service. Not a single complaint from you until the end, until the day you fired him. The world tilted. Margaret gripped her cane harder, knuckles going white, the mahogany wood creaking under the pressure. Thomas Thaxton. She hadn't thought that name in decades, hadn't allowed herself to think it, had buried it under layers of other decisions, other employees, other necessary eliminations. He was late, Margaret heard herself saying. The old justification, automatic, rehearsed, the same words she'd told herself for 40 years. 3 times in 1 month. 2 important meetings. In business, you can't tolerate. He was late, Joyce interrupted, her voice hard as tempered steel, because my grandmother was dying of cancer. Stage 4. He was taking her to chemotherapy appointments at 6 in the morning before his shifts with you. He never complained, never asked for accommodation or special treatment, just tried to do everything, be the perfect employee and the devoted husband. She took a step closer, and Margaret found she couldn't move, couldn't retreat further. And you fired him. No severance, no reference letter. Blacklisted him throughout the industry because Margaret Whitmore doesn't tolerate imperfection. Because you needed to make an example. The floodgates opened. Joyce's controlled composure cracked like ice under pressure. And 40 years of inherited pain poured out in a torrent that couldn't be stopped, wouldn't be stopped. Do you know what happened after you destroyed his career? Do you have any idea? Her voice rose, years of restraint finally breaking. He couldn't find work. Nobody would hire a chauffeur that Margaret Whitmore had publicly fired. Your name carried weight, still does. And you used it like a weapon. He sent out hundreds of applications. Hundreds. Every hotel, every corporate car service, every private household in the state. Nothing. Silence. Or worse, interviews where they'd recognize his name and show him the door. Joyce's hands clenched into fists, oil-stained knuckles white. He burned through their savings in 6 months, trying to keep up with my grandmother's medical bills. Lost their house, the one he'd been so proud of, the first thing he'd ever owned outright. My grandmother died in a county hospital ward because they couldn't afford the cancer treatment she needed. Died surrounded by strangers instead of in her own bed because you decided her husband was disposable. Margaret's cane slipped from her hand, clattering against the concrete like a judge's gavel. She slumped against the Rolls-Royce, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the heat. He started drinking after she died, Joyce continued, relentless, years of silence demanding their due. Not a lot at first. Just enough to sleep, to forget, to silence the voice telling him he'd failed her. But it grew the way these things do. By the time I was born, he was barely functional. My father worked 3 jobs, trying to keep us afloat. Construction during the day, security at night, weekends at a warehouse. Worked himself into the ground trying to be enough for all of us. Her voice broke, but she pushed through. He died of a heart attack at 48, dropped dead loading boxes because his body just gave out from exhaustion and stress. And my grandfather? Tears cut clean tracks through the oil smudge on her cheek. He died 10 years ago, right here in this garage he'd scraped together with nothing. Still working on cars because it was all he had left. Still believing he'd failed everyone who'd ever counted on him. Still carrying the shame of the day, Margaret Whitmore decided he wasn't perfect enough to deserve basic human decency. The memories flooded back, vivid and damning. Thomas Thaxton, always early, always professional, always with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made clients feel safe. The day she'd fired him, she'd been furious about missing the opening statements at a zoning board meeting. She'd made an example of him. Pour encourager les autres, she'd told her assistant with cold satisfaction. Send a message that nobody, absolutely nobody, is indispensable. He left something, Joyce said, her voice raw and scraped empty. She disappeared into the small office attached to the garage, returning moments later with a worn leather journal, its cover cracked and faded, its pages yellowed and stained with oil and time. He wrote in this every day for 30 years. Started the day after you fired him. Kept going until the week before he died. She didn't hand it to Margaret. Instead, she opened it to random pages and read aloud, her voice shaking but steady. March 15, 1983. Applied to 12 positions today. No responses yet. Eleanor starts her 3rd round of chemo tomorrow. I told her everything will be fine. June 2, 1983. Savings account nearly empty. They're foreclosing on the house. Eleanor doesn't know yet. I don't know how to tell her we're losing everything. November 8, 1983. Eleanor died this morning at 6:47 a.m. I wasn't holding her hand. I was in the waiting room because I couldn't afford to stay in the room with her. They charged by the hour. The entries charted a descent. Hopeful job applications met with silence, savings dwindling to nothing, the shame of unemployment, the first drink to numb the pain, the second, the 100th. But they also contained other things. Memories of driving the silver cloud, the pride he'd taken in keeping it perfect. Technical notes about engine specifications, dreams of teaching his son the trade, and in the final years, entries about Joyce. April 3, 2015. My granddaughter has her great-grandfather's hands. She understands engines the way some people understand music. Maybe she'll fix what I couldn't, not the cars, but the family. Maybe she'll restore what was broken. Margaret listened with tears streaming down her deeply lined face, her carefully applied makeup running in dark rivers. Each entry was an indictment. Each memory a knife finding its mark. She'd never thought about Thomas Thaxton again after that day. He'd simply ceased to exist in her world, erased like a mistake on a balance sheet. Joyce closed the journal carefully, reverently, as though handling something sacred. I learned this trade from him, she said quietly. In his final years, when he was sober enough, he taught me everything. How to listen to engines, how to understand what they need, how to fix what's broken. He said fixing cars was easier than fixing people. You can always find the right part, the right tool. But people? She shook her head. People carry broken parts their whole lives. She looked at the Rolls-Royce, then at Margaret. I can fix your car, Mrs. Whitmore. 20 minutes, like I said. Not because you deserve it, not because I've forgiven what you did to my family, but because my grandfather taught me that the work matters. That doing it well matters, regardless of who benefits. Margaret watched through her tears as Joyce moved to the Rolls-Royce and opened the hood. The young woman's hands moved with absolute confidence, testing connections, adjusting fittings, replacing components she pulled from organized shelves. Her movements were economical, precise, almost choreographed. She spoke softly to the engine, almost tenderly, murmuring to the metal as her oil-stained fingers worked, the same way Thomas used to. Margaret remembered now, memories flooding back with crystalline clarity. Remembered seeing him through the rear-view mirror during those 8 years, his lips moving as he drove, conversing with the machine as though it could understand him. She'd found it odd at the time, slightly ridiculous. Now she understood it was love. Exactly 20 minutes later, Margaret checked her watch twice, unable to believe it. Joyce wiped her hands one final time and slid behind the wheel. She turned the key. The engine roared to life. Smooth, powerful, perfect. The distinctive purr of a silver cloud running exactly as it should, as though it had never failed at all. But Margaret barely heard it over the roaring in her own head, over the thunder of 40 years of consequences finally demanding their reckoning. "How much do I owe you?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper, stripped of all its former command. Joyce wiped her hands on the eternal rag and shrugged. $200, standard rate for a fuel system repair and pump replacement. $200. Margaret spent more than that on a single lunch. She opened her Hermes handbag with shaking hands, fumbling past her phone, her compact, her lipstick. She pulled out her checkbook, an antiquated thing she kept for sentimental reasons, having written her first property offer on a check just like it. She wrote carefully, her arthritic fingers making the numbers difficult. When she handed the check to Joyce, the young woman's eyes went wide. "No," Joyce said immediately, trying to hand it back as though it were burning her fingers. "No. I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you." "It's not for you," Margaret said, and her voice was different now, stripped of arrogance, naked with grief, raw in a way it hadn't been in 60 years. "It's for him. For Thomas. For what I owe him. For the 40 years of life I stole from him with one thoughtless decision made in anger. She paused, looking around the garage with new eyes. The worn but meticulously maintained equipment, the small office with its filing cabinets and faded photographs on the wall, the hand-painted sign her grandfather had made himself. You said he dreamed of teaching the trade, of restoration, of passing on what he knew. Margaret's voice cracked. Let me fund that, a scholarship program, for young women who want to work with their hands, learn trades, who get told they don't belong in garages and workshops and construction sites. Women like you had to fight for every inch of respect. Joyce stared at the check, $500,000 written in shaky script, then at the old woman whose face had crumbled into something raw and real, something human beneath decades of carefully constructed armor. Money doesn't fix what you broke, Joyce said, but her voice had softened, the sharp edges worn down. It doesn't bring him back, doesn't erase what happened to my grandmother, my father, the years he spent believing he was worthless. No, Margaret agreed, tears still streaming down her face. Nothing can fix that. Nothing can undo it or make it right. But maybe, her voice broke completely, maybe it can build something new, something he would have wanted, something that honors what he tried to teach you, that the work matters, that passing it on matters. She looked at Joyce directly, unflinching despite her tears. I can't repair what I destroyed, but maybe I can help you build something he'd be proud of. Joyce held the check for a long moment, then carefully, deliberately folded it and placed it in her coverall pocket. Margaret took out her phone, miraculously working again now that the car was running, and with trembling fingers scrolled to her assistant's number. 3 rings, then Patricia's efficient voice. Mrs. Whitmore, thank God. The consortium is asking. Cancel it, Margaret said quietly. Silence. Then, I'm sorry, what? Cancel the Pinnacle Project meeting. Cancel the deal. Tell them Margaret Whitmore is withdrawing her interest. Patricia's voice rose to a panicked pitch. Mrs. Whitmore, this is a $600 million development. Your legacy project. You can't possibly. Some things matter more than money, Margaret said, and meant it for the first time in 60 years. She ended the call before Patricia could argue further. 6 months later, the Thomas Thaxton Scholarship for Women in Trades was announced at a press conference in downtown Nashville. Margaret, now visibly frailer, her cane more necessary than decorative, stood beside Joyce and told the complete truth. No sanitizing, no corporate spin, no careful PR management. She spoke of Thomas Thaxton, of her cruelty, of the generational destruction one moment of ruthless leadership had caused. She spoke of his loyal service, his gentle manner, his wife's cancer, his desperate attempts to be perfect at everything. She spoke of firing him without mercy, of blacklisting him without thought, of erasing him from her consciousness as though he'd never existed. And she spoke of Joyce, the young woman whose skill and grace had shown her it wasn't too late to repair some of what she'd broken, even if the original damage could never be undone. The scholarship grew, first 10 recipients, then 50, then hundreds. 10 years later, Margaret was 97, bedridden in the palliative care wing of Vanderbilt Medical, the same wing she'd donated 40 years earlier, back when charitable giving had been about tax advantages and legacy buildings rather than genuine human connection. Her hospital room wasn't filled with business associates jockeying for position, no lawyers reviewing estate documents, no distant relatives hoping for inheritance. She had none of those, had sacrificed family and friendship on the altar of success decades ago. Instead, the room was filled with 30 young women in work boots and coveralls, electricians with tool belts, plumbers with calloused hands, welders with burn scars, mechanics with grease under their fingernails, carpenters with sawdust in their hair, all scholarship recipients, all women who'd been told they didn't belong, who'd fought for every inch of respect, who'd found opportunity through a program named for a man Margaret Whitmore had destroyed. Joyce was there too, standing closest to the bed. She now ran Thaxton Restoration and Classics, a successful business employing 50 people and specializing in vintage automotive restoration. Her grandfather's hand-painted sign still hung at the original garage, now the company's flagship location. Margaret's final words were whispered to Joyce, her voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. Did I repair enough? Joyce took the dying woman's hand, soft now, paper-thin skin over fragile bones, and thought of her grandfather, of his journal entries, of his belief that the work mattered, that doing it well mattered, regardless of who benefited, of forgiveness earned not through words but through action, through years of sustained effort to build rather than destroy. "You tried," Joyce said quietly. He would have respected that. Margaret died that night, peacefully, surrounded by the women whose lives she'd helped transform. Her obituary in the Tennessean mentioned the Iron Lady's business achievements, the buildings, the developments, the empire built from nothing. But the longest paragraph was about the Thomas Thaxton Scholarship for Women in Trades, which by then had helped 847 women pursue careers they'd been told weren't meant for them. The vintage 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud was donated to the Lane Motor Museum, fully restored to showroom condition. A brass plaque on the display read, "Restored by Joyce Thaxton in 20 minutes that changed 2 lives forever." Because some repairs are mechanical, hoses and pumps and fuel lines that can be replaced with the right parts and the right knowledge. Others are moral, decades of cruelty and thoughtlessness that require years of sustained effort to even begin to address. And the most important repairs happen when power finally faces the consequences of its cruelty and chooses, at last, to build instead of destroy. When it's never too late to try, even if redemption remains forever incomplete. 20 minutes at a roadside garage, 40 years of consequences, 10 years of repair. One woman's legacy transformed from empire builder to bridge builder, from destroyer to restorer. Some distances can't be traveled in a Rolls-Royce, no matter how perfectly maintained. Some journeys require breaking down completely before you can find your way home. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.